everyone. Welcome back to the Bruin Political Union podcast. I'm your host, Mia Thorsen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon. I'm the BPU podcast director.
And we want to go ahead and welcome you to the 6th episode of the Bruin Political Union podcast titled Anti-Asian Hate in the United States. In this episode, we will be discussing the recent rise of national violence against the Asian community, America's history of discrimination against Asians, and the Asian student experience at UCLA. Today, we are very excited to be talking with Ms. Russelie Bongolan, an accomplished political strategist who served as Deputy Director of Coalitions for the Biden-Harris ticket in the state of Georgia, and after which served as Political Director for Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock's runoff campaign to become Georgia's first Black senator. And Russelie was my boss for a little bit back in the day. So hi, Russelie, we're really happy to see you.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you, Mia.
And we also are very excited to have Ms. Karmen Pang, a second-year human biology and society and economics student who is a member of the Vietnamese Student Union and Asian Pacific Coalition, where she has advocated for educational equity, specifically in the context of higher education. Welcome, Karmen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And really quickly for our guests and our viewers, we wanted to, on behalf of the Bruin Political Union, we wanted to make sure that this is a comfortable sharing space. This is a very difficult topic that's attached to, can be attached to a lot of trauma. So we want to make sure that you guys only share what you're comfortable with and don't feel any undue pressure from us. Okay, Shannon?
Yeah, so before we begin our discussion, we first want to highlight, obviously, this historical rhetoric that has been exacerbated, the current attacks against the Asian community in the United States, to provide some context in our discussion. So in regards to the origins of the anti-Asian rhetoric with COVID-19, Asians have faced increasing levels of fear and anxiety due to both COVID-19 health risks, but also racist remarks, including those of former President Donald Trump, who named the COVID-19 virus the Kung Flu or China virus during the beginning of 2020 and throughout his presidential campaign. In regards to national attacks, for example, elderly Asians face larger levels of stress from potential attacks such as robberies, shootings, and assaults, such as we see in San Francisco. Between March 2020 and February 2021, the group Stop AAPI Hate identified 3,800 self-reported attacks perpetuated against Asians in the United States. And one of the most devastating attacks that occurred recently was in March 2021, when a white man attacked 3 Asian-run massage parlors in Atlanta and killed 6 women. In regards to attacks on students, Asian university students are facing physical and verbal harassment, such as Zoom bombings, anti-Asian posters outside of dorm rooms, and vandalism on university property consisting of racist language in regards to the Asian American community with COVID-19, also on social media. And according to NPR, Asian students are choosing to continue remote learning at higher rates than other student demographics for fear of being racially targeted on campus, which will obviously result in educational disparities in the future.
Thank you, Shannon. Again, this is extremely heavy material, and we wanted to, again, reiterate that this is a safe space, and we're trying to create a dialogue and raise awareness for this, because it has not seen the level of awareness that we believe that it deserves. So to start off with kind of a general question, and this is open to either of you, can jump in. So and again, if you feel comfortable sharing, how have you been personally affected by the COVID-19 rhetoric and the increase in anti-Asian physical and verbal assault? And how has it affected your mental health and the way that you seek to establish proactive change within the United States? So either of you can jump in for this one.
I can go. Well, I think at large, the COVID-19 virus has affected me and my community quite a bit. I'm Filipino American, and I believe the statistics, something is around like 1 in 4 nurses in California is Filipino. I think we make up about, nationally, I want to say like 5% of all nurses are Filipino, but like 31% of COVID-related deaths of nurses were Filipino. In the height of the COVID-19, pandemic, I would say once a week I was hearing about a family member getting sick. I personally did not lose any family members, thank God, but I have a lot of friends who, passed away. I don't know very many Filipinos at all who don't know of someone who has passed, either within their family or, not so far removed. Mental health wise, it was rough. We'll get into my political work, but it's relatively new to me. I was in like the private sector, and every day you go to work and you're thinking about your family members, and you're thinking about their safety, but you have to perform as if nothing is going wrong, which honestly was not possible for me. And then I wouldn't necessarily say that I personally have experienced like anti-Asian rhetoric or hate, but going through that in your mind and having that as part of your psyche every day, and then hearing even people who speak about the pandemic very nonchalantly, or like, oh, I don't know anybody, or like, oh, did you guys go out for 4th of July at the time? Like, yeah, we're gonna rage against the machine, like, don't be a sheep, like that type of thing. Like, I was raging on the inside just hearing coworkers talk about it like it was no big deal, because every day it was a part of who I was. And then, with the incidences of violence that happened, for example, when the shootings happened in Georgia, I did live in Georgia for some time. I worked on the Georgia campaigns for several months. And at that point, like, I felt like, even though I'm from Southern California, like, those people are my people too. And I go to spas. Culturally, like, it's a thing. So you start to think like, well, that could have been me. I have extended family members who are estheticians, do nails, do eyebrows, that type of thing. And it's, someone told me when they had reached out to check in on me, and I'm very thankful for those folks, told me like, it's exceptionally hard to hold your head up high and to advocate for your own existence when you're in the throes of grief. And so, that's really what it's been like the last 6 months, is you're off and on scared, off and on grieving, but also, finding solace in solidarity with others and finding the strength to go and do something good. And to be there for your community.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Russelie. That's a really, I think, valuable insight for people who may be less informed on the reality of the situation of the AAPI community in the last months. And because I know you personally and am familiar with your work, if I could just brag about you for a second really quickly. Through these tumultuous times and just not a very comfortable last couple of months, Russelie has done revolutionary campaign work for the United States, and especially in the Deep South. So if that's not a testament to her resilience, I don't know what is. I just felt I needed to say that.
Yeah.
And Karmen, if you wanted to jump in, if you had anything to add.
So with the recent rise of violence against the Asian American community, there's definitely that lingering fear in the back of my mind at all times that myself or one of my family members or friends may be a victim. And it wasn't really a complete surprise that there would be this rise in anti-Asian hate and verbal abuse, especially when Donald Trump, someone with lots of influence, used the term Chinese virus. And I do want to mention that there have been studies done. I think there's one at UCLA in particular that showed that using hashtags with with this like sort of rhetoric of Chinese virus could have contributed to the rise in anti-Asian hate incidents. And I guess being constantly aware that people who share similar features to me may be a target in to some people is mentally draining, and especially when these incidences are occurring in areas I grew up near and where many of my older female family members live. And there is data that shows that Asian American women are 2 times more likely to report being subject to anti-Asian hate. And when I think about what happened in the Atlanta spa shooting and the response to it, I definitely feel a level of disappointment and anger, because this is the result of the hypersexualization of Asian women and racism at play, not just a bad day, as law enforcement put it, or a sex addiction. So I guess overall, I feel that my mental health has definitely taken a toll, but when I'm also looking at the response by the Asian community, that does give me some hope.
Absolutely, and thank you, Karmen, for highlighting the insensitivity and the rhetoric that we have seen surrounding these what they are hate crimes. And I've seen a lot of rhetoric in news publications kind of dancing around the words racism, the words anti-Asian hate, the words hate crime, as a way to take the gravity away from the situation. And I think that's extremely irresponsible. And I think that it is very important that we use our platform here on the podcast and just in general to bring the reality of the situation to light. And I think it's very important that you highlighted the specific demographic of Asian women being disproportionately targeted. That's a very important statistic that I'm not sure is mainstream to a lot of maybe our listeners or just in general. So again, thank you guys for being vulnerable with us here. To transition now into national and student experiences, Russelie, you worked for the Biden and Warnock campaigns in Georgia. How did the racial dynamic in the South compare to the one that you see here in SoCal?
Yeah, so before working in Georgia, I actually lived in North Carolina for a little while. So I'm pretty familiar with kind of how the South works. In general, like Atlanta, big cities, you don't really feel that big of a difference in terms of, I don't know, how racially folks interact or whatever. Like everyone's just like, very much like working together, and it feels like home to me. I want to say the biggest difference here is the levels of like non-familiarity. Like it's pretty common for folks in like Southern California, the West, the coasts, to use the term AAPI. But it was not uncommon for people to ask, like, what is that? What does that acronym stand for? And I had some folks who had been doing Asian organizing for a while, and they were like, maybe you should think about changing the signage to just say Asian American so that it's easier for people to digest. So it's just a lot more educating. The other piece of kind of how it's different in the South from like LA is that there are definite divides of like when you're outside of Atlanta. I don't think in LA I've ever been afraid to, I don't know, wear a t-shirt that might show my political inclination. But out there, I was very cognizant of how I presented. I already knew that walking into spaces, people would be like, oh, she's definitely not from here, because there's not too many Filipinos in like rural Georgia. But I definitely did not want to I was very choosy, I'll say, about when I wore like a Vote Warnock sweatshirt. There was an incident, and it was kind of funny, kind of not. I was in the hotel. We were about to go to a campaign event. I was standing next to our like young Georgian coordinator. He's this African American student from Morehouse, amazing speaker, and then like another woman who she's white and from rural Georgia herself, and we were all like organizers for the Warnock campaign. We all have all on our gear, and the elevator doors open, and then this family, unmasked and not voting the same way that we would, I guess, looks at us kind of like a little menacing, like up and down. And then the dad turns kind of beet red and is like, Warnock, he's a socialist. And like, you could tell that he wanted to kind of like tell us off a little bit more, but then the elevator doors closed in his face. So we were like, okay, yeah, we'll wait for the next one, like that type of thing. And I feel like in LA, like, I honestly don't feel like I would ever feel like I would have that kind of outward, visceral conversation. The other thing about the South that makes it different from LA is particularly for like the AAPI communities, the Latinos communities, they're smaller. They're about like, I want to say 5%-ish or less of the electorate. And it's primarily like a Black and white conversation. But the thing that we really had to hone in on is, especially because the voting margins were going to be so slim, is that you can't discount any of those like 5% populations, and you have to find all of the major voting blocks. So that was also something that was different, is making sure that we really pushed like the coalition organizing so we could all be on the same page.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that something I've noticed with a lot of the student body at UCLA is that we are very much in this kind of LA/West Coast Bay Area kind of bubble in terms of experiences. And a lot of our ideas about the reality of the South or the reality of areas outside of maybe California are based on stereotypes that might be a little bit classist and just stigmas that we have around these regions. So it's really valuable to have someone who knows and understands the dynamics there and the dynamics here to be able to speak on that for us. And so that's very cool. Thank you for that, Russelie. And Karmen, can you describe your personal experience as an AAPI student, specifically at UCLA or in general, and the roles you would like to see filled in your community at UCLA?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, so I've had a really great experience at UCLA. I think within the space of like Vietnamese Student Union and APC, I've gotten to see a lot of civic engagement. When I was working on the Prop 16 campaign earlier this fall, I got to see a lot of Asian Americans working to promote this proposition for affirmative action. And yeah, you see that also within the sphere of USAC. So there's also a lot of like that interracial like coalition building that we can see. But yeah, I think it's really amazing that we can see Asians in positions of our student government and who are advocating for our community's needs.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, representation is so valuable on any level for any community. Absolutely. So to transition now into government initiatives, to give a little bit of background information. In the federal government, during his first week in office, Joe Biden signed an executive order banning anti-Asian language within the federal government. And in April, the Senate passed a bill that would establish an official in the US Justice Department to expedite review of anti-Asian hate crimes. And on the state government level, California lawmakers dedicated 1.4 million in funds to resources, advocacy, etc., against anti-Asian hate crimes. So, Russelie, what actions would you like to see taken by the federal and state governments concerning AAPI hate? And are the initiatives that we have already seen, do you think they're enough?
I am very encouraged by what we've seen so far. I would like to see that continue and expand. I think it's a great start. And what I mean by expand is we need to think about, like, there's a thought that, like, you want to think globally, act locally, right? And so, like, with all of the things that have happened so far, like you had mentioned, like the anti-Asian hate crime bill that was passed, that level of awareness needs to be brought into, like, corporate America, into, the university settings, and then also, like, even, in elementary school settings, in the playground, like that type of thing, like, there needs to be, like, everyone taking accountability of not just making sure that Asians are represented, right, and have a seat at the table, but that our voices are valued, and given credence. So I'll give you an example. As they were filling seats for appointed offices, Senator Tammy Duckworth noticed that there weren't any Asians particularly appointed in larger appointed offices in the White House. And stereotypically, Asians are thought of as, like, well, if we don't get our way, we'll just, like, hunker down and keep working, that type of thing. And she and Senator Hirono said, no, if you guys don't give us more representation, give us more seats at the table, listen to our voices, we're going to start not voting for stuff. And it was like a flex of muscle, right? And I think it was surprising. And they did get a lot of flack, like, hey, why don't you just, like, fall in line? But they were taken seriously, and now there are several initiatives to prioritize getting more API representation in White House appointed seats. I think we should take that example and, again, like, expand that, right? So what does that look like? Corporate wise, like, folks might say, like, oh, we hear you, Asians, we stand against hate. Okay, but, like, how many managers do you have? How many C-suite executives do you have that are actually Asian? Like, don't just, gather us in a group and say, like, hey, look we care about y'all. We have some, right? Like, do you care about our perspectives and the value that we bring to the table? I'll also give an example of, like, again, like, Filipino nurses, right? Like, there are, like, do you have Filipino nurses who are making decisions about the policies in the hospital? Not just, do you have a charge nurse who's managing other nurses? Like, in the classroom, like, are you also teaching, like, the kids, like, what does a curriculum look like, right? Are you allowing them to explore, like, different parts of American history that are not particularly talked about? So a long answer to your question is, like, everyone needs to take responsibility at the different levels and take what's started and expand upon it.
Absolutely. I think I see that a lot in terms of advocacy, as that one bill will be passed and there will be kind of like a one and done sort of attitude about it. And that's not the reality of change. right? It has to be, like you said, there has to be accountability, and as starting as early childhood education, all the way up through the private sector, through corporate America, through um, living and working as an Asian American person. Um, and Karmen, if you had anything that you wanted to add on.
Mhm. I definitely agree that there needs to be a lot of work. There needs a lot of work to be done, just because, um, in terms of like discrimination against like Asian Americans and like fear that Asian Americans are gonna, um, I guess, overtake like all these like jobs or whatever. That sort of discourse has been lingering for like centuries, and there's so much that needs to be done to address that because we're seeing the effects of it right now, and it's definitely not a small feat to conquer.
Absolutely. And being my mom is half Hispanic, that rhetoric that you were just talking about, that they were going to take over, is something that I have seen within mine and my mother's community in terms of like undocumented immigrants, like, oh, they're going to take all of our jobs. And there seems to be a lot of this hate that I've seen or witnessed or observed in this country stems from a deep-seated insecurity of Americans. And that is something that is not very often talked about. And so, Karmen, just to continue to talk a little bit about UCLA, because we are a UCLA podcast. So Asian students constitute the largest group of students at UCLA, making up 28% of the total UCLA student population. And UCLA sent out a recent statement regarding Asian hate and attacks. So what are some changes in the UCLA rhetoric you would like to see happen surrounding AAPI students, and how can UCLA better support the AAPI community at this time of heightened racial animosity?
Um, I think it was a good thing that they did send out a statement, but I would kind of like to see more actionable items on their emails. Like, what are they going to do in specific to address anti-Asian hate? And um, I guess I would kind of like to see our professors addressing this more because I know like people who feel that the response to what happened in Atlanta wasn't like really what they expected, considering when you compare it to the response to like the George Floyd shootings. And though they're like separate incidences, they kind of stem from a similar struggle.
Yeah, so some more concrete action would be something that you would hope for in the future from UCLA itself. Yeah, absolutely. And having 28% of a student body be AAPI, that's not a small fraction. That's more than a quarter, and that is um, it's really we profit off of UCLA as an entity profits off of their students, right? That's a large portion of the student body to negate in terms of hate in the community and possible mental health issues that may arise from that. So to transition to talk a little bit into mobilization. So combating insurgencies of hate of any kind requires a united, impassioned front. You need a lot of people to fight something like this. The AAPI community needs not only internal support, but the support of other community groups in the name of equity, a mobilized front. So Russelie, what strategies did you use to mobilize the AAPI communities during your campaign work, and how successful were you?
Yeah, so the strategies to engage Asian American voters is first is a keen understanding of like the major voting blocks of the folks you're trying to get. First of all, organizing the Asians at large, like we're not a monolith at all. There's like 5 different, 12 different communities within one, depending on like, who's the most populous where you're at, right? And then there's like the older voters versus the younger voters. So that's basically how we kind of parsed it out. We wanted stuff that was like in language. So we made sure to put in ads and resources into different media outlets, particularly in South Asian papers, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean. And then we definitely put in a lot of resources into voter protection. So one of the things in Georgia is, they're very big about like, they'll get rid of your ballot if your names don't match or something, right? And so like, we all know that like Asians will have their like American name versus their Asian name. Sometimes the Asian name might have a letter or two off, like that type of thing, or like they're not used to signing their names in English. And so then when their ballots would be reviewed, they'd be like, oh, this signature doesn't match. But it's like, well, they rarely sign it with English characters. So of course it's going to be different. So a lot of resources were poured into our voter protection team. And like I said, like all of the in-language stuff. Now that's all the older voters or like newer immigrant voters who are of the AAPI community. Then we look at the younger voters and what was our strategies for that. And so we specifically had phone banks to call younger voters. We did some text banking as well, because we know Gen Zs and you guys are not picking up the phone for us, we know. And then the other piece was really doing our best to get the best data as possible. So what do I mean by that is that like a lot of the voter outreach, it's good when people of the same community are reaching out to the same community. Like there are particular ways of phrasing or answering the phone to give respect to like our elders. And if someone hears that, they're going to stay on the phone with you for like 2 seconds longer and be like, oh yeah, yeah, I might vote. Thank you for reminding me. So we needed the data to be able to parse out, like, here are the Chinese names, here are the Vietnamese names, here are the Filipino names. So like that gets tricky, right? In California, we take data on demographics like crazy. I heard that like in Florida, right? As I have a friend who did organizing down there, they only take demographics on white, Black, and other for the most part. So like when you're trying to get pieced out information, it's near impossible. It takes money, it takes time, it takes funds. So that was also part of our strategy, is to get as best data as possible and then get particular groups reaching out to particular groups. The other strategy that I really like leaning on is relational organizing. So what does that mean? That means reaching out to people in your own contact list. And so there's particular trainings that we did for folks to get them to call everyone that they knew. And there were like apps that were developed that was cool. So you could have visibility onto who in your contact list is an infrequent voter. And so you could call them to remind them and to check in on them. So those types of strategies were really what we leaned in on, and it was very effective, particularly for the Biden campaign. The statistics were like 19% more AAPI voters cast a ballot in early vote than had voted in the entirety of the 2016 election. In Georgia, AAPI early voters exceeded the 2016 turnout by 57%. And like over 30,000 voters had voted for the first time in their life. Yeah. So then for the Warnock campaign, like I tried my best to replicate what we had done before, and then also tap into like even more in-depth, how do we reach out to like the other AAPI populations that are smaller, but there. So like there are different communities in Georgia that actually have welcomed in a fair amount of like refugees. And so I actually had a coordinator who was specifically reaching out to what we called the new Americans. So folks who had just immigrated here. And it's interesting, like a lot of their histories was interesting. I worked with some Bangladeshi organizers, and they had explained to me that a lot of the voting history of the folks who had come here was that, like, in their country, if you voted and were vocal about who you voted for, you could get yourself into a lot of trouble. So people either did not vote or did not talk at all about who they were voting for. So the idea that your vote is secure, wouldn't get you into any trouble, and that it mattered was new to them. So that type of really targeted messaging and finding the folks in those communities who could earn the trust of people whose voices mattered, we really lean into that.
That's incredible. I mean, that's the American dream, right? I think I just want to stress this for our viewers. You were talking about the percentages of voter turnouts that you had, 57% more, 16% more in an election that was as close as the one that we just recently had was. Those are incredible margins to have had turnout. I just really wanted to stress that in politics, we usually see like 5% increase, 6% increase, maybe like 0.5% increase, and to have that more than double in the course of a few months of campaigning and a few months of extreme hard work is what it was, and so much networking and so many phone calls and so many hangups and all of that. That's really incredible.
And I have to say too, it's not just the campaigns who were responsible for those numbers. Like, there are really great organizations out there that did it independently. There are nonprofits, just like Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight, both within Georgia and nationally, who were in there in the thick of it, getting all the API voters out. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's incredible. Thank you so much, Russelie. And so, Karmen, is the Vietnamese Student Union, or APC, currently working on any initiatives that you know of? And how can non-AAPI students show their support and solidarity for the AAPI community at UCLA and in general?
I'm not completely sure about the details of this, but I know that APC is like advocating on the for I think it was the Chinatown Center for Equitable Development to fight like exorbitant like cost of living that might push out some of the older residents and that sort of thing.
I love that. That's protection of the community on every level for every demographic, right? And sometimes I know in the Hispanic community and the white community, which is not something that I say very often, but it can be our elders can be forgotten about sometimes. And I know that in the AAPI community and as well as in the Hispanic community, there is so much respect that our matriarchs and patriarchs have. So that's a very important initiative. Okay, well, thank you both so much for joining us today. That is all we have time for at the moment, but I could talk to you both forever. Thank you so much for illuminating us, shedding light on something that is emotionally difficult, that's physically difficult to talk about, and really helping us try to educate our viewers and listeners. So thank you both so much. And if either of you have any closing remarks, now's your time.
Well, I just want to say how encouraged I am by participating in this podcast with you three lovely ladies. The America that we want to see is really in y'all's hands. the folks in your generation. As a older millennial, I spent most of my time as a, being interested in politics, trying to convince my friends, like, yo, you should be looking at politics too. And I just feel like Gen Z folks, the folks who are in college right now, like, you all are really tuned in and making big strides. And it makes me happy to see it. I'm proud of you guys.
I guess I'd just like to add that it's really important that we remain like vigilant and yeah, and we just like Russelie said, stay engaged, because we are like a community that has a lot of power, and we saw that like in a lot of the elections. It wouldn't have been possible without all these people, and yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining us yet again. And I just want to say a last remark. If any one of our listeners has suggestions regarding video ideas, what information you'd like to see, or would guests to invite next to the podcast, you can contact the Brand Political Union at bpu@g.ucla.edu. Thank you guys so much.